But right now, I'd like you to listen for the presentation on the country example of Nepal by UNICEF and Usha Mishra Hayes, who has come from the country office there, and she is the Chief of Social Policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome back. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, great. Hello? Oh, yeah. Hello? This is fine. Okay, great. So, not a flash in the pan. Before I start even with the caveats, a very quick introduction to social protection in Nepal consists of the usual elements. You know, you've got the formal social pension programs for the employers or employees of the government sector. And we have various kinds of insurance as well. And then we have 5 different kinds of cash transfer programs, which are called social assistance programs. And so the crux of the social protection program in Nepal are those 5 different kinds of social cash transfer programs. And they cover about 15% of the population at max, right? So this is very much about horizontal expansion of social protection program rather than just reaching those who have already been reached through social protection program, obviously with all the challenges that the other speakers have talked about. So a lot of disclaimers. This is obviously not a program which has reached to scale. So I'm presenting the approach that we are taking to, which has been built upon the emergency cash transfer program, which was implemented in the wake of the earthquake. So very much a work in progress, and there is an attempt to draw out lessons from the past, from the near past, and also from the very, very near present. Hope you'll bear with me. So Nepal, I'm sure you recognize this. Overall, of course, a very exciting country because the Mount Everest is there and all the hiking and the trekking and huge number of tourists who come here every year. Apart from that, a population of about 30 million, it's a very young country. 4 in 10 are children. And many of those children are actually multidimensionally and monetarily poor. So what does poverty in Nepal look like? It's a very flat poverty line. So there's a lot of huddling poverty in Nepal. And especially children bear the brunt of poverty disproportionately. About 4 out of 10 children under 10 or under 9 are multidimensionally poor. So the huddling poverty and the near flat poverty line means that the well-being of households deteriorates rapidly with even a slight change in the income and in the external conditions. This was about children under 5 who are poorer than general population. Overall, along with the socioeconomic vulnerability that we just saw, it's also one of the most disaster-prone countries, the 37th most disaster-prone country. And of course, you remember it from the 2015 earthquake. So what happened? Flashback. 2015, April, a big earthquake, what is known as Gorkha earthquake, struck Nepal. It was about 7.8, 7.9 on Richter scale. Massive number of people affected, about 8,000 to 9,000 dead, 22,000 affected with injuries. Huge number of houses destroyed and all the other kind of catastrophic outcomes that one can expect from a large-scale earthquake. In that context, obviously, again, a very, very complex, a very chaotic situation, you know, coordination being a challenge, and everybody rushed to give aid, and you know, the airports were getting clogged and everything else, and it was clear that relief in kind has to go out because the roads were not there, the bridges had collapsed, many of the markets in those areas were just not functioning because of various reasons. So in kind relief was very clear, right? But as the situation started settling down, I must say it was the ingenuity of UNICEF management, UNICEF technical staff at that point of time, who thought about how do we give them additional support through recovery and maybe through rehabilitation. If not through rehabilitation, at least post-relief phase. You know, how should we help them more? and help them quickly and help them in a way that enhances their autonomy and gives them more choices to do what they can do with the kind of transfer that we can do. So the modality became important. And it was very obvious that one of the very efficient ways could have been these 5 social assistance cash transfer programs that I had mentioned earlier, which reached about 15% of the population. And mind you, these population, though these were categorically targeted programs, but these people were one of the most vulnerable. And I'll tell you who these people were. They were elderly, those above 70. There were Dalits. There were ethnic minorities. Dalits are, by the way, for those who don't understand the term, they are at the lowest rung of the caste system, which is there in the Hindu society. So in many ways, they're also considered marginalized, untouchable in certain cases, excluded. They're also children under 5, and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying that the social protection programs were covering all the vulnerable section, but I am saying that people that they were covering were certainly the most vulnerable. So it made a lot of sense for UNICEF to at least target those who were already part of the system, because it was easier to reach them. The lists were there, the registries were there, there was a mechanism for reaching them, and that establishing that mechanism takes months and years, right? So obviously it makes a lot of sense to use an existing social protection system to reach out to those who are affected. So the vertical expansion, so to say, of the social protection made a lot of sense. So there are 2 phases of emergency cash transfer. The first one was all about vertical top-up. It was all about reaching out to those who are already parts of the system and give them an additional money. But after 2 or 3 months, UNICEF recognized that it was not enough, because there were many more who were left out, precisely the points that Rachel, you were raising, and Rachel were raising, right? So what did UNICEF come up with? And again, I think this was, again, very innovative of them. They applied an experience from one part of Nepal where social protection had already covered all children under 5 in a universal fashion. So the earlier National Children Under 5 was not a universal program. It was only for children of Dalit caste. It was universal nationally. But there was a particular region in Nepal called Karnali, which is drought-prone, and there all the families which had children under 5 were part of the social protection system. So UNICEF transferred and translated this experience from one part of Nepal onto the rest of the affected districts and advocated for a horizontal expansion of social protection. So the second phase was about horizontal expansion, and it was also about adjustment. Nupur will probably agree to that. So it was different. So these 2 phases are different, and you can see both the approaches are very much in operation. Obviously, UNICEF was not the only one who was distributing cash, and UNICEF was working with the government, so it wasn't really a UNICEF program. It was a government program supported by UNICEF and supported by those who were supporting UNICEF, at least for this program. So just a very quick comparison, if we look at overall social kind of assistance or overall relief assistance for earthquake, then 15% was cash and voucher, but if we looked at UNICEF's assistance, it was 21%. So obviously, UNICEF was a front runner. Talked about vertical expansion, and here is now a very interesting thing which has started happening for the entire social protection system. So there is a 2-way feedback. It's just not the social protection system helps a disaster response and hence should be shock responsive, but actually lessons and imperatives of a crisis context helps the system learn as well. And this is what the slide tells us. And I think this was brilliant. I wasn't there, by the way. That's why I can say it was brilliant. So I'm just giving kudos to those who were there. So, and this was like just not cash. It was also program communication. And that, I think, builds in or kind of sows the seeds for tying in of the element of communication for development with child grants program that we are now promoting. But let's look at what's happening. Vulnerable groups, vertical expansion, communication of complementary messages around nutrition, health, education, etc., and implemented through existing local government system. Local government system, we talked about that. We'll come to it later on as well. So what were the outcomes and lessons learned? As I said, only 15% covered, so a huge amount of exclusion. So everybody who was affected by earthquake was obviously not covered. there was low enrollment in banking systems, so cash was still difficult to get out, and there were system-related, obviously, frictions which partners had to deal with, government had to deal with. Overall, it appeared to us that the social protection system was not ready for a large-scale cash transfer. It's great that it was able to give out cash when it had to, but if we actually started looking at it as a reliable partner for a relief, for a disaster relief, then it really had to up its game. And that's where the important lessons go for the larger system strengthening approach that we are trying to implement now. There was also this issue about capacity at local government, which came out as a big lesson. Right, so despite these challenges, the beneficiaries had really appreciated the fact that the government reached out to them even after the so-called, the usual period of relief was over. Like, usually there is this huge flux of relief items in the first few weeks following a major disaster. But the people really appreciated that even 2 months, 3 months down the line, the government recognized that these people were still very vulnerable. They were still in need of multiple requirements: food, education, clothes, variety of them. And they appreciated the fact that the government did give them a cash. So these are the kind of quotations which is basically kind of hinting that the social protection, if it's shock responsive, does do something to the social contract between the citizen and the state. So following that, fast forward, and it's nothing as neat as it looks here, right? It has been a very chaotic exercise. It has been 2 steps forward and 1 backward, and we're still there. We are still there. There are still some policy decisions which haven't been taken, but hang on, let me take you to where we are right now. So what we have recognized that it's all about strengthening fundamentally the social protection system, right? And for us, at the top is an accelerated expansion of the Child Grants Program. So following the experience of the earthquake program, which had went out and horizontally expanded and covered all the families which were affected by earthquake and had children under 5, following that, we have now been able to advocate for a universal under 5 cash transfer program, and I think that's a great huge. That's a big step forward for lessons feeding backward into the system. So that's first one. But we don't stop there. It's really about the entire system rather than just about one program. So we have agreed with the government to help them in the policy development. And here's an interesting thing about the policy development, and this kind of goes back to how advocacy sometimes gets done in a very funny fashion. So we're sitting in the National Planning Commission, we're talking about, okay, how does National Periodic Plan or 5-year development plan talk about social protection? What should be the title? So we kind of, we gambled with inclusive, sustainable, and we finally ended up with, guess what? Resilient social protection. Because the government recognizes that social protection in Nepal has to be ready to respond to disasters. So that's the policy work. The strategy is still not finalized. I mean, there is a draft that has to be updated. We have also agreed in principle providing institutional development support to Planning Commission. So they do have a vision of setting up a separate social protection coordination office. And very importantly, we are strengthening the evidence base precisely to feed back to the advocacy to strengthen our arguments about how do we strengthen it, how do we ensure that exclusion is minimized, more people who are vulnerable should be included. Along with that, we are very fortunate that DFID came along, and we are implementing a shock responsive program or a project. With DFID, hopefully it becomes a program. So it's a very small project, but it's a kind of a catalyst project for us. It's a seed money, so to say. You can see details here, but important thing is that it obviously gives us resources for producing evidence, and we have done a lot of studies with ODI, OPM, and other consultancy firms. But there is also an option to implement a pilot should a flood happen. So that pilot would cover about 70,000 people, and that will test everything that we have been doing so far. And I'm not saying that we have done much, but still, we'll test the approach, and we'll test some of the change in the thinking, and will probably make it faster to go forward because there is a policy decision, there is a thinking which is synchronized along those lines. So that's the DEVCO project, and I think that's very useful for us, which is helping us amplify our efforts to a national level rather than just to a small project. I've talked about that. But what happened in the meantime, and this is again a lesson from that we can draw as we implement. This is called in-streaming. Some people have said it's in-streaming. So the DEVCO project was all about having a standard operating procedure agreed with the government and evidence generation. And obviously the third was pilot, which may happen, may not happen, depending upon when the floods strike and to what extent they strike. But the third element, which is implementing it at the local level, is our innovation, which is in-stream during the course of the project. And we said, we don't have to wait for having a standard operating procedure. We can start getting those palikas ready to implement an emergency cash transfer program when floods happen. And we are implementing that in 10 palikas. There was a bit of a back and forth with DEVCO, but they were glad to support it. Okay, so what's happening right now? And this is kind of this is more localized right now with the monsoon preparedness, as I mentioned, trying to customize it to decentralized approach. We are working with partners, so there are other partners like World Bank. There is a whole social protection task team in Nepal. If you're more interested, I can tell you that, and strengthening national systems.
A few minutes to go.
Okay. So let me tell you about the operationalization at the palika level or the municipality level. The first is that we have to assess their own capacity as to how they deal with vulnerability. So, for example, how would they reach out? What is their capacity to do vulnerability assessment? What are the systems in place that they have? So we do a capacity assessment, and then we come up with a strategy for addressing these gaps. So this pilot is being implemented in partnership with our DRR emergency colleagues. So we are not working in silo. Then we're actually helping them to do a vulnerability assessment. And here is another one. So we moved away from household targeting to a TOLA targeting, which is called a locality targeting. So it's a combination of universal approach plus geographic approach plus poverty and vulnerability approach. So I think that works very well for us because it would not create tensions. And frankly speaking, given the flat poverty line, when a flood comes into a locality, it kind of strikes almost everybody similarly. And then the third element is very important. We are trying to link those households in an ex-ante fashion, if I may use the term here, with banks. So financial inclusion. So again, because then it becomes easier for us to transfer cash.
1 minute.
Yeah, this is pretty much the last slide. So, and what are the elements of the standing operating procedure? This is the standard operating procedure, which is near ready. It was agreed and debated and discussed very intensively in a residential meeting of 5 different agencies of the government, with UNICEF being the support behind that. And what has been very interesting is the move from the vertical to the horizontal expansion. And this is a tricky one, because the government is worried about managing expectations and obviously the resources. That's another issue. But it's great that they recognize that earthquake program did not reach everybody who was in need for assistance, and they have agreed in principle to the horizontal expansion. And is obviously aligned to all the existing policies. So, in a nutshell, I think it's always important to ask the tough questions. Is it enough? Are we really doing what we should be doing? Is it really working? Not be presumptuous. Evidence, evidence, evidence. And then quickly move from doing an emergency cash transfer towards a more system approach, which is also SRSP. SRSP does not mean that you have to forget about systems, because SRSP, at the heart of SRSP, should actually be ex-ante mitigation of vulnerabilities and graduation elements, as well as obviously adjusting social protection system to more crisis protracted situations being one example. Last but not the least, this is a very chaotic, and again, something that you cannot really neatly map out. It's not a linear exercise at all. So one has to be ready to go in sequence, but also to go in parallel. So as I was telling you earlier, first we thought we'll do an SOP, and then we'll orient all the palikas after the SOP are done. And we said, no, the SOP can happen. Let's start orienting the palikas. Let's start building their capacity. So certain things can be run in parallel. Certain things have to be sequenced. So it all depends upon the context. So these are the lessons from Nepal. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Usha. We've got time for 2 questions. Does anyone have a question or a point of clarification? Please go ahead. Yep. Microphone, you don't have one?
I don't need it.
Okay, good. Small room. Indeed.
Thank you very much, Usha, for the presentation. Interesting example. On clarification, well, further information on the horizontal expansion. Vertical expansion, we have, I think by now, very good examples. Horizontal expansion of programs is something which we have much less evidence, and I wanted to know a little bit more how that was brought about, and how UNICEF made the case for it. What was effective in discussing with the government and the partners around that. And the second one...
sorry, it's just one question.
That-
Sorry, yes. So time for 2 questions, unless someone else has another question. Okay, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Obviously, these programs are implemented at the local level, and you mentioned a couple of times the importance of strengthening the local capacity. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more in practice how that was done, basically.
Okay, great. Okay, so in case of Nepal, one example of horizontal expansion from the past, from the earthquake, was reaching all children who are under 5. Earlier it was all children of the Dalit caste. So that was the horizontal. Horizontal means you are kind of using the same system but registering more vulnerable people who are close to your initial criteria, right? What we are advocating for now is horizontal expansion at the locality level. So all the households who live in a particular most flood prone, so for example, or drought prone, they should be pre-identified and they should be linked to bank accounts. So there should be a kind of a pre-register for the floods and for droughts and all that. So that's the preparation for horizontal expansion. Now, why we were able to do this in 2015, I think all the brilliance to Tomu Hozumi, who was my rep at that time. But most seriously speaking, I think UNICEF is obviously a very credible partner, but they also brought in huge amount of evidence around, for example, the child poverty, how the families which have children are some of the most vulnerable, and government understanding the importance of investing in early childhood as well. I can't tell you exactly. I wish I was a fly on the wall, so I could have reported back, but I can't tell you about that time. But I gave you a few things which might work because it was actually expanded in a substantial manner. You know, in 19 districts, all the families which had children under 5 were made eligible by the government, and so that was a momentous policy decision. Now, I can talk about now. So when I came in Nepal about 5 months back, the draft SOP talked about vertical expansion only, and it talked about reaching out to the existing social assistance beneficiaries, right? And the lessons from earthquake and all the other reports are very clear that there are high exclusion rates and all those who are vulnerable and not. So we opened up the dialogue and we said, this is the evidence from OPM, this is the evidence from ODI, and you know yourself, we don't really have to give you evidence, you know what the context is. And these people would need assistance regardless. We sat in a number of meetings. By number, I meant 2 meetings. And So basically we spoke to the government, we brought in the evidence, we took our DRR colleagues, and we kind of lobbied hard with all the arguments, and the government has thankfully agreed that yes, it makes a lot of sense to actually at least pre-identify the most vulnerable localities. Yeah? Okay. Local government capacity building, 30 seconds. Work in progress. We are looking at strengthening, we're looking at partners who are working with them. So there's some partners who are strengthening their MIS, which is great. UNCDF is helping financial inclusion. In some cases, we have recruited a consultant to help them do the vulnerability analysis. So because it's a decentralized, the environment is in flux right now. Decentralization is in operation. The capacities haven't settled down. So there are some capacity gaps at all levels, but particularly at the Palika level. So you step in. Don't be ashamed of stepping in with warm bodies. Okay, thank you.
Great. So if I can invite Georgia and Cecile to give a succinct presentation.
Thank you.
That would be appreciated. Or presentations.
Oops.
Ah,
What am
allow
I doing?
me.
Oh, anyway, we'll see if this is, I'm sure this is the right one. Oh, it's except the that version isn't the most up to date. The most up to date is the one that's on the kind of compiled. Whilst that's just being sorted out, hello everybody, can you hear me okay?